Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we are back talking about Survivor SA following the official cast reveal for Return of the Outcasts. Now, this was sort of a long time coming, as obviously this season was announced back in November, and back in January I even made a Dreamcast video where I talked about who I thought was likely to be cast and who I would want to see on that cast based on who I thought would be brought on, and now I get to talk about the actual cast here. Now, technically, this cast has been leaked for a while now. It was leaked back in March by Inside Survivor, but I wanted to wait until the official cast reveal in order to make this video. And essentially, this video is just going to be my reaction to it. It's not going to be a preseason power ranking. I figured it'd be best to wait until closer to the season before I get into that. But for this video, I'm just going to be comparing this cast to what I thought it was going to be based on that previous video, and just go through each of the people that did make the cast. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So first up, I should talk a bit about the Dreamcast that I had put together back in January. And basically what I made was an 18-person cast with equal representation from the three most recent seasons, those being Philippines, Island of Secrets, and Immunity Island. Granted, I did include an honorable mentions section that was primarily people I would have cast from the earlier seasons up through Champions. However, for the main cast, I only included people from those three most recent seasons, as those were the seasons that were all produced by the current production company, and they're all relatively aired in the same era per se, and I felt like it was relatively unlikely that they would cast too many people from those earlier seasons, especially even Champions, which a lot of people do see as sort of this bridge season between the early seasons of SA and the modern era that we have now. And the other thing about this cast is that I primarily looked at people from these seasons that I would assume would have been cast on an all-star season anyway. So a lot of those people were some of the biggest characters and players from those seasons who more often than not made the merge in relatively deep runs. Yes, I did have a couple pre-mergers in there, but for the most part, I kept the actual representation of pre-mergers to a minimum for that list in order to reflect how I felt like a realistic all-star cast might be put together. Granted, we obviously knew that we wouldn't have any winners or anyone that made it to Final Tribal, but I figured that it was best to make it as close to what we would see from, say, Second Chance in US compared to, well, what we ended up getting. And on that note, let's talk about what we actually got. And obviously, there are two major surprises in regards to the factors that I just mentioned. One is that they actually did cast a significant amount of people from the pre-Philippines era. We have 5 people from Champions, and we even have 1 person from Maldives in there, which is pretty impressive, not gonna lie. I am happy that they cast all these people from these relatively older seasons, but it was obviously something that I didn't factor into my own Dreamcast, as I figured that it wasn't too likely. And obviously the other factor is the amount of pre-mergers, as of course they actually cast so many of them that it became the main dividing line for the two tribes. There is literally a pre-merged tribe and a post-merged tribe, which is pretty funny, all things considered, but I also think that it really helped to tie into the actual theme of the season being Return of the Outcasts. They really wanted to go all in with this Outcast theme by casting people that you would almost never expect to be cast on an all-star season, namely all these pre-mergers. And obviously we'll get into them in a bit, but obviously those were two main things that a bit surprised me when I saw the actual cast. And with that, let's actually go through each individual member in the cast. Now, as I said, my Dreamcast was an 18-person cast. This actual cast is a 20-person cast, in which 6 people from the Dreamcast ended up making it, including 2 honorable mentions that I cited in there. So really 8 people that I mentioned from that previous video ended up making the actual cast, which obviously leaves a number of people that I hadn't previously talked about. So without further ado, let's get right into these people. So starting off with the Premerged Tribe, we have 10 people here to discuss. We have 3 people from Champions, 2 people from Philippines, 2 people from Island of Secrets, and 3 people from Immunity Island. And 2 of these people ended up being on my Dreamcast way back when. And obviously, I'm going to be going through these people in the order in which they originally played. So first up, the first player we have to talk about is Killarney from Survivor SA Champions. She was the 3rd boot on the season there. And I'm not too sure what to make of her, if I'm being honest, as on one hand, she did get pretty unlucky with how she was treated out there. I mean, I felt like she was pretty on the outs from early on and didn't really have too much potential within the game. And to her credit, like the fact that she is one of these older players, it is possible that in the years since then, she's probably gotten more life experience, probably has had more time to reflect on her previous experience and maybe play a different game than she did the first time. But honestly, compared to some of these other people we'll be talking about, I feel like she doesn't have as much potential as them. But again, we'll see what happens. Next up, also from Champions, we have Shona. And this one's a bit more interesting as obviously Shona had a pretty fun run on her season with her initially being aligned with David and seemingly to be on the bottom at first by Xavion, only for then to get Grant on the board. And through that, they're able to blindside Ashley and Marsha and get through those some early rounds. But then obviously she decides to try to steal David's idol and blindside him with it, only for that to really blow up her game and her to get blindsided instead. Really fun storyline there. But obviously I am pretty excited to have Shona back on the season. And I think it'd be interesting. I mean, again, I feel like she is a pretty big fan of the show, someone that understands the game pretty well, and definitely someone who has a lot of potential to learn from her mistakes and really make a deep run this season. So Shona is someone I'm pretty interested to see, even though she wasn't on my Dreamcast. And the other person that we have from Champions to be on this Premerged Tribe is Phil. And Phil's a bit interesting to see here as well. Again, sort of an interesting character from his season. You know, he was someone that stole food and tended to eat it, like without his tribe's permission, kind of like another person we'll be talking about later on in the video. And I'm not too sure how he'll do on this return. Again, he was someone who was a bit sneaky, and he definitely harps on that in his bio here. Now, again, I guess the one thing to his benefit is the fact that, again, he did play longer ago, meaning that there's more time for him to have potentially grown since his last time, so we'll see how he'll do this season. But on the offset, like, he is not someone that I'm the most excited about doing well, but again, we'll see what happens. Now we're jumping forward to SA Philippines, where we again have two people here. And one of them is pretty interesting here. And we actually have Sheamus, the first boot of the season here. And actually, if we're comparing like all the first boots they could have brought back, I think Sheamus is probably the one that has the most potential. And again, I feel like despite him being the first boot, he was a pretty fun character during his first round. We really saw him build that alliance early on that tried to get out Tom here. But obviously, that failed to do so, as Tom was able to build a counter alliance with getting Ace on their side to flip, resulting in him being the first boot there. And I found that pretty interesting. And obviously, that alliance he built was able to hold together for the next round, even going to Rocks. So I feel like the fact that he was able to build a group that tight really speaks to his potential in the game. And I think it would be interesting to see how he would do on a season like this. Now, granted, there is potential for him to be like another Francesca, in the sense that he is going to be the first boot from his tribe simply due to him being a first boot. But considering the whole tribe is made up of pre-mergers, I feel like that's a bit less likely, but still, I'm very excited to see how Sheamus does here. Next up, we actually have the first person that made my Dreamcast, and here we have Taehyun. And I'm glad Taehyun is here. I mean, he was a pretty big super fan coming into Philippines, and he played relatively well in the pre-merge, being this big, really strategic person. He like controlled some votes early on, but then eventually we see his closest ally PK flip on him and blindside him in the pre-merge, which was a pretty fun round there. And I feel like coming into this new season, I feel like he does have potential there. Again, he is one of the bigger fans out there, and definitely someone who definitely has a lot to prove on his return. And it will be interesting to see how he plays alongside someone else who we'll be talking about relatively soon, given that they are on the same tribe. But for the time being, I feel like compared to those two people, I feel like he has more potential between those two, considering how he played the first time and considering the time that has passed since his first season that has allowed him to potentially grow and learning from his mistakes. So I feel pretty good about Taehyun coming into this All-Star season. Now moving on to Island of Secrets, where we have two pre-mergers here on this cast. First up, we have Felix, and this was definitely one of the more interesting casting choices here. Now, granted, it could be pretty interesting, as obviously we saw in his first season that he was a bit of a domineering figure, definitely was a big leader figure, got into fights with Tanya, who we'll be talking about in a moment. And obviously, he was eventually taken out the swap because basically everyone was getting fed up with his like attitude with the game. And it sounds like in his bio that he has definitely learned a lot from that experience, and it'll be very interesting to see if he's able to execute that on the island here. Now, granted, I think he would have some potential if he is able to do that. So again, I feel like that'll be a key for him in how he'll be able to move forward. But I feel like just on the offset, he should be able to do well. I mean, considering both his potential to change, but also the people that are on this cast. So we'll see how this all plays out with Felix. Now moving on to someone who I actually just mentioned, and here we have Tanya. And again, it's very interesting that she's here on the same tribe as Felix. And I feel like this could be interesting. I mean, she was definitely a interesting character on an original season, getting all the way to the swap, and was able to outlast Felix before being picked off for being a weakness here. And it'll be interesting to see if she'll have the same fate here again. Again, she is one of the older people on this tribe here, so it'll be interesting to see if she's able to avoid that pitfall again. But again, I feel like she could bring some entertainment to the show, and especially with her being on the same tribe as Felix, I feel like that could lead to some interesting TV. So again, I like the casting choice. Now we're moving on to Immunity Island, which has 3 pre-mergers on it. And while one of them made my Dreamcast initially, the other 2 are 2 of the most questionable picks on the cast, at least for me. And we'll get into one of them right here. And first up, we have Pinty, the second boot of the season. And to me, I mean, Pinty was sort of a weird pick, as she wasn't really that interesting of a character on Immunity Island. And obviously, gameplay-wise, she didn't really offer too much either, where she obviously was aligned with Chappies early on. And she definitely came off as a bit aggressive to some of the other tribe, to where she was sort of the easy first boot off her tribe. And she definitely talks in her bio about how she has grown in the months since Survivor, and obviously through that she could potentially change it up. However, I feel like something that will definitely be a factor for me when talking about these people from the most recent seasons is how much they really changed. Now, obviously talked about that with the champions and some of these older players, and how they definitely had more time to actually change and reflect on their experiences. And to be fair, it is possible that, you know, like maybe some of the older players haven't changed too much, while some of these more recent players have changed quite a bit. However, it's definitely not as likely, considering how little time there's been since the most recent season compared to what we saw with some of the older seasons here. So is it possible that Pinty will change it up, definitely show some more self-awareness, definitely be more willing to play the game? I mean, it's definitely possible, but I feel like it's certainly less likely than some of these older players here. So again, I feel like that, coupled with her not being as interesting of a character, makes Pinty a bit of a questionable choice, but again, we'll see what happens. Next up, we have another really questionable casting choice here, and here we have Teresa. Now, admittedly, I feel like Teresa is a better character than Pinty is, but obviously a worse player in my opinion, where she had a really terrible run on Immunity Island, where she was pretty much on the bottom for her entire run, actively turned down alliances even when people approached her. And obviously at the swap, I mean, while she should have been in a position to be the swing vote there, with the minority group approaching her with the idol, she pretty much botches that so badly that that minority group decides that it's better for them to play their idol and risk continuing to be at the bottom than to keep her in the game, as she wasn't seen as that reliable of an ally. So really terrible run on Immunity Island. And to be honest, I'm not too sure how much she has changed between this season and this current season we'll be getting. Now, again, she does talk a bit in her bio about how she's sort of learned to change a bit, how she is planning to play a more social game this time. Again, we'll see what happens here. But on the offset, I'm not feeling too great about her. But again, just like Pinty and some of these other picks, we'll see what happens with her. Finally, to wrap up the pre-mergers, we actually have someone that also made my Dreamcast here. And here we have Dino. And I'm glad Dino's here, as I feel like he is a player who, similar to Taehyun, is a super fan, is someone that really came out wanting to play a strategic game. But unlike Taehyun, I feel like he had a much worse social game, to where people didn't really trust him, and through that he was in a pretty precarious position for a lot of the game there. And similar to the more recent players that we just mentioned, I'm not entirely sure how much he'll be able to really change it up this time. I mean, his bio doesn't really mention too much about him improving his social game. He's talking about learning to rely more on his game knowledge and instinct, which I don't think is really what he needs to improve on. Granted, he will be on a tribe with Taehyun, and I feel like he definitely could have some allies there compared to what he had on Immunity Island. But again, we'll see with a lot of these other more recent players to see how much they're able to change it up. I feel like this grouping of people will be very interesting to see on the return here, and whether they'll be able to really address the things that caused them to be pre-merged boots on their initial season. So Dino is someone I'm very happy to see, and obviously it'll be interesting to see how he plays here. And with that, we are now moving on to the post-merge tribe, which is a bit more interesting, as we obviously have 10 people here as well, with 1 person from Maldives, 2 people from Champions, 3 people from Philippines, 3 people from Island of Secrets, and only 1 person from Immunity Island. So again, a bit of more interesting tribe to consider here. And obviously it's also the tribe that has more of the people that made my Dreamcast, as again, that cast had mostly post-merge people on there. But without further ado, let's get right into that tribe. And first up, we have the 1 representative from Survivor Maldives, and again, someone that I had as an honorable mention in my Dreamcast, but here we have Taehyun. And I'm very happy to see Taehyun here, as he was definitely one of the biggest players from this older era of Survivor SA, and I'm really glad to see him being involved here in this modern era. Again, on his initial season, he was a very dynamic player, flipping back and forth throughout the entire game, again, constantly like flipping between the normal people and the celebrity alliance, to where he eventually did start to become a target in the post-merge, but he still managed to make it all the way to the final 7, which was pretty impressive in his own right. And again, I feel like he is a big fan. He is someone who, again, has kept up with the show, and I feel like he is someone who could be very interesting in the return. Now, granted, I think the fact that he is the only representative from his season could be an issue in terms of him building allies, but it could also be a benefit in the sense that he has played so long ago and from a season that people don't remember super well, that again, people could forget who he is. So that could be a very interesting element to his game there. And again, I'm very excited to see how he does on this season. So again, I'm very happy to see Taehyun here. Now we're moving on to Survivor Champions, where we have 2 representatives here, one of which was an honorable mention here. Those would be very the other person probably should have been, but here we have Marion. And I do regret not talking about her as an honorable mention at the time, but she is obviously someone that I was very interested to see in Champions, and now to see her again in this season, and especially being on the same tribe as Shane, will be such an interesting storyline to see there. And I feel like she is a very strong player. She is a pretty big super fan. I feel like she is someone that's probably grown a lot since her last time playing. And yes, while she was the merge boot on her season, she was still a pretty big player on that season. And I feel like she has a lot of potential coming into this return. So I'm very excited to see her coming back here. Now we're moving on to the person who I did have as an honorable mention, and here we have Shane. And similar to Dino and Taehyun, like, I'm pretty happy to see both Shane and Marion here on the same tribe and on the same season together, and it should be very interesting. I mean, similar to Marion, Shane is a massive character, but also a pretty good player in his own right. He obviously was known for finding idols and even stealing idols from other people, which again isn't allowed nowadays, but sort of crazy how he was able to do that. And again, it should be very interesting to see how he does this time. And again, similar to Marianne, like the fact that he has such a long layoff between his first season and now, again, it'll be interesting to see how much he's grown since then, and whether he's able to translate his gameplay into a modern context, which, to be fair, I feel like he is one of the more adaptable players compared to some other people. But again, we'll see what happens. But on the offset, I'm very happy to see him here. Now moving on to Survivor Philippines, where again, we have 3 people to talk about here. And first up, we have Palesa. And Palesa is interesting as she's one of the biggest characters to come out of this cast. She was really a fan favorite at the time of that season. And obviously, she was a pretty big player as well. Granted, not the best player, but she obviously is most known for the idol play, where she literally pulls the idol off the podium in the middle of tribal and then plays it on herself, which of course we later saw Adam attempt to do in Winners at War, but only to have that not work for him. But again, that's a good moment for Palesa, and really coming into the season, it should be interesting to see how she does. and particularly how big her target is, as I do worry that she could be targeted early on due to being this big name, relatively speaking. But again, like, we'll have to see what happens with her. But off the bat, I'm very happy to see her come back, and she was someone that was on my Dreamcast. Next, we're moving on to Toni, who, again, is fine in my opinion. I mean, it wasn't my favorite character per se, but she's good enough, and I feel like she is a pretty competent player with her being a super fan, and was someone who later on started to lose control at the merge, and eventually was sort of an underdog figure along with Palesa and PK, but obviously was taken out as a result. And again, it should be interesting to see how she does on the season. Again, I feel like she could be a bit overlooked compared to some other people on this tribe, but again, those are all things that could work in her favor. So on the whole, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how Toni does on this season. And last up from Philippines, we have another player who was on my Dreamcast, and here we have PK. And I'm pretty happy to see PK back as well. Again, he was a pretty notable figure from his season. He was obviously the orchestrator of the Taehyun blindside after initially being aligned with him. And considering Taehyun is on this cast, I mean, that should be interesting to see. Now, granted, they are on different tribes, but if they were to get like swapped together, that would be a very interesting relationship to see play out there. And on the whole, like, I feel like PK could be interesting. I mean, he talks in his bio about wanting to improve his social game as well as his strategic ability. So I feel like those are all things that can work out in his favor. So I feel like in general, PK could do pretty well here, and he is definitely someone that I feel pretty confident about. Now moving on to Island of Secrets, where again we have 3 people to talk about here. And first up, we have the merge boot in Merrell. And again, it's a bit interesting that she's here instead of CPay, though considering someone else that's on this tribe, I kind of get why they picked Merrell here. And again, I feel like Merrell could be interesting on the season. Now granted, I mean, there is potential for her to be an early boot. However, I feel like, again, she does have some advantages here. She does have, again, Dante, who we'll be talking about in a moment here. And she also has, again, pretty well-rounded player on the whole. I could see her integrating pretty well, and through that, she could be a pretty big player in this season. Again, she's also a big fan, and she really talks about how she wants to play a more rooted game, to be careful with her empathetic nature, and to just have fun. So, again, it'll be interesting to see what happens here. But again, I think there's a lot of people that I feel that way about. So, we'll see what happens with Merrell. Next up, we're talking about Dante, and this was a bit of a more surprising pick for me, but considering they cast Merrell here, it kind of made sense to cast Dante as well, as they were closely aligned on their initial season. And again, it's sort of interesting to see him here, this sort of big physical guy that really emphasized challenge strength and being a provider in his initial season. He obviously finds an idol with Merrell, and we see him attempt to target Jeffrey right before the merge, only for them to successfully fluster idol. And through that, they were essentially on the bottom from that point on. And from that point on, like, he was essentially a goner along with Merrell. And he does talk in his bio here about how he wants to play a more social game this time, which, again, makes sense. I mean, again, it'll be interesting to see whether he can really do that. However, I feel like compared to some of these other people, he's definitely not someone that I'm more confident in compared to some other people. But again, he does at least have one ally coming into the season. And again, it'll be interesting to see whether he can really change. But coming into the season, I'm not feeling the most confident in him. And the final person from Island of Secrets here, we have Steffi, who was on my Dreamcast. Now granted, a big reason for that is because we couldn't have Rob or Nicole on this cast due to, again, the fact that they made Final Tribal. So I felt like Steffi was the next best bet here. And it should be interesting for her coming into the season. Now granted, she wasn't the best player in the world, and I feel like she was a bit too passive at points. Now, she does talk about how she wants to work more on her social game this time, but then again, I think a lot of other people are as well. And again, she should be pretty interesting to see on the return here. And I wouldn't be surprised if she tries to shake things up. Now, granted, do I think that this is particularly likely? Again, we'll have to see, but I feel like coming into the season, she should be a pretty interesting character nonetheless. And finally, the final member of the cast here, and the one person from Immunity Island, we have Chappies. And again, similar to Steffi, Chappies also made my Dreamcast here, and he's actually the highest ranked player out of anyone in the entire cast, having made it to 3rd place. And he's a pretty fun character coming to the season. He obviously was a pretty likable underdog for the most part. Obviously, he had the whole food stealing thing in the post-merge, although even then the show tried to present that in a positive light, so there's that. And again, he is a pretty fun character on the whole. Not the worst player in the world, but similar to Palesa, I very much fear that he will come into the season with a pretty big target on his back, and arguably more so than Palesa, as again, he was on the most recent season, and he came the closest to winning out of him and Palesa. So I'd be very interested to see how he integrates on here and how early he is targeted, so to speak. But if he is able to get past that initial target, I feel like he could endear himself to a number of people on here. And, like, who knows what could happen there. So I feel like that he could also be a shield as well. So it's not like he's a guaranteed early boot. But I feel like coming into the season, he is not the best position to do super well for himself winning wise. But again, we'll have to see what happens. And I am glad he is here, so I wish him the best of luck. And that is my reaction to the Survivor SA cast here. And again, I am pretty excited for this season, as I feel like, yes, there are some questionable picks here. I feel like there's a lot of people here that have interesting storylines coming to the season, which could lead to some interesting potential being shown here. Now, granted, there are a couple people who I feel like could be targeted early on, all things considered, but I feel pretty confident that this will be a very strong season of the show, and obviously I will be covering it on this channel. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps out with the channel. Now, I am planning to do a preseason power ranking as we get closer to the start of the season, so stay tuned for that. And then obviously once the season starts, I am planning to do coverage of it, so stay tuned for that. Now granted, they did say that they're doing 4 episodes a week, so that should be interesting. But again, I'm still very excited for the season nonetheless. And of course, there is content like this moving forward for the channel, so stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the video. See ya.